I'm Uriel Bowser. I'm the mayor of Washington, D.C., and I want to provide a briefing to D.C. residents. We plan to be here today to announce our new downtown testing site, and I will announce that and give you all the details of our new downtown DC testing site. But I want to start first with the significant damage that we saw done in our city last night. I am joined by members of my public safety team, also public health team, also to address your questions. I have spent this morning walking around the city to assess damage, and there is significant damage in the downtown areas, especially in the blocks immediately around Lafayette Square. And I want to be very clear about something. As the nation's capital, we are frequent hosts to First Amendment demonstrations, and we applaud the American spirit of protest, and especially protest to their federal government. However, we do not and we will not allow the continued destruction of our hometown by people who are coming here to protest or by DC residents. And as I said this weekend, we certainly empathize with the righteous cause that people are here protesting. Every single American should be outraged by the murder of George Floyd. However, smashed windows and looting are becoming a bigger story than the broken systems that got us here. So I want to implore DC residents to think of ways to help and to be a part of the solution, but certainly not part of the destruction. Tonight, I'm ordering another curfew in Washington, D.C. We want your voices to be heard, but we also want to protect the safety of everyone in our city. Tonight's curfew will begin at 7 p.m. and will run for 2 days. With that said, I'm going to hand it over to Chief Newsham to discuss our situational update, and then we'll answer your questions.
Good morning. Thank you, Mayor Bowser. Thank you for your continued amazing leadership through these difficult times. I'm Peter Newsham. I'm the Chief of Police for the Metropolitan Police Department here in D.C. Obviously, what we saw last night was a continuation of what we saw Saturday night with destruction of property and unnecessary injury to people in our city. We've seen rioting. We've seen obviously significant property damages, and the damage and the looting extended. There was the major point of impact, as the mayor mentioned, was in and around Lafayette Square, but we also had looting in Northeast D.C. and Upper Northwest D.C., and also stretching out to our Georgetown area here in Washington, D.C. So the looting and some of the destruction of property was expansive. Yesterday around 2 o'clock, there was a First Amendment demonstration that assembled in the area of our Howard University campus. That group, which got to about 1,000 or so attendees, made its way to Lafayette Park. When they were at Lafayette Park, there were some skirmishes with the federal police that had assembled there. During those skirmishes, rocks and bottles, incendiary devices were thrown. There were attempts to breach the police line, but it was, I would describe those skirmishes as minor in nature and easily manageable. As the day progressed and as the sun set, we saw a significant increase in the purposeful destructive behavior. Our Golden Triangle Business District was hit particularly hard. There was vandalism and looting, as you know, in Northwest and Northeast D.C. The antagonists continue throwing objects and incendiary devices at officers. There was a significant fire at the St. John's Church that I know you were all aware of, the historic St. John's Church down by Lafayette Square. We worked closely with our law enforcement partners particularly with the DEA and the FBI, who were readily available to provide resources. We continued to work with the U.S. Park Police, the U.S. Secret Service, and the U.S. Secret Service Uniform Division. The tactics that I saw last night by the people, the antagonists I will call them, appeared to be organized in nature. In some instances, MPD had to deploy OC spray and sting ball to control some of the crowd activity. Preliminarily, we made 88 arrests. 44 of those individuals, so half of those individuals, were charged with felony rioting. A number were charged with burglary too. We will provide the details on the arrestees and where they're from. 2/3 of the arrestees were charged with instances of felonies. There were also a significant number that were arrested for violating the curfew. We are going to, as I spoke about yesterday when we talked about this, we are not done making arrests. Our city, thankfully, has a very expansive CCTV system. We have government-owned cameras. We have privately owned cameras. We are urging our business owners that if they do have images of people either destroying property or hurting somebody, that they share those images with us, and I can assure you we will follow up. We had 7 MPD officers that were injured. None of them required the officers to be transported to the hospital. We had far fewer MPD vehicles that were damaged. We had 9 vehicles that were damaged. The mayor mentioned, and I want to thank her for this, for having our curfew set at 7 p.m. I want to make this abundantly clear to our community. This is not a decision that we take lightly. This is an inconvenient decision for many of the people who live here and work here in the District of Columbia. This will disrupt your lives. This is a decision that was forced upon us by the behavior of the people who are intent on coming to our city and destroying property and hurting people. I think we can take any questions that anyone might have.
Before we start, let me just say a couple of other things. Let me just say a word about our testing location. We announced, I think last week, that we would be making some changes to our citywide testing facilities. This is a new site. We are on F Street between 4th and 5th Streets Northwest near the Building Museum. We're going to be shutting down this part of the street so that we can have this walk-up testing site. You can walk up here without an appointment if you need a COVID test. And we also, beginning today, have replaced the testing site that was at the United Medical Center and is now located at 2241 Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue. And it is both a drive-through and walk-up site. This morning, we reported 56 new cases of COVID-19 in the district, bringing our total to over 8,800 cases, and sadly 2 Washingtonians have succumbed to the virus since we last reported. So we'll take your questions. Yes, ma'am. And just if you could let me know who you are.
Kim Dozier from Time. You mentioned that the protests seem organized in nature. Who do you think was behind it, and do the numbers of arrests show you who the protesters are, either D.C. residents, racial makeup, and what is the status of police towards press who are clearly marked as press?
Yes, so let me ask the chief to talk about what he knows about the organization and tactics and who was arrested, and also your question is related to curfew in press.
Some people, members of the press, got roughed up. A CNN cameraman got hit by a baton. He was clearly carrying a camera. Why did policemen do that?
Yes, the chief.
So sure, I think you have two different questions. You want to know the demographics of the people that were arrested, where they're from, and maybe whether or not if it's organized, what the organized groups are. That remains to be seen. That will be part of our ongoing investigation to find out if this was in fact organized as it appeared to be, who was responsible for that. And there are statutes, there's federal statutes and local statutes that can address an organized continuing criminal enterprise to come in here and to destroy our property. And so that would be one thing that we'll be looking at moving forward. We will release all of the demographics. My public information office will give you the names of the arrestees, the demographics, where they're from. They were largely from this region, that the people that were arrested. But I don't think that tells the whole story. I don't think we will have the whole story until we've made more arrests, and we can, because I anticipate there will be more arrests from the images that we have. The help of the community and the business owners will be able to identify those people and get a better picture of exactly who these folks are.
And the member of the press that got...
You're going to have to, if you have a specific instance of where you believe that a police officer acted inappropriately, we have a very thorough system of investigating those issues. Please pass that along to us. We'll investigate it. All of our police officers wear body-worn cameras. If you don't want the police department to investigate it, we have an independent Office of Police Complaints that can look into that matter. And I think your question alludes on the question of coverage of the curfew tonight. We will use sound judgment, which we always do, to ensure that the media has full access during the curfew.
And just more than that, media and essential workers are excluded from the curfew timeframes. Yes.
For clarification, you said the curfew starts at 7 and runs for 2 days, but I'm assuming it kind of lapses during the day.
Correct. Yes, and for the hours that we're interested in, 7 to the following morning.
So this has no impact on the functioning of the primary. If you want to go vote tomorrow, that's still fine?
Oh, absolutely not. And thanks for pointing that out. We want to make those hours clear, and we'll make those hours clear in the order. Yes.
Mayor Tom Fitzgerald from Channel 5. Question about the curfew thinking. Yesterday during the briefing, early on, you had indicated it would not be a good idea yesterday at one point to issue a curfew because you were under the impression that the protesters would not adhere to a curfew.
Not the protesters, the ones that were intent on breaking the law.
That the ones who were intent on breaking the law would not follow a curfew. Could you take us inside about when the determination and why the determination was made ultimately last night to install a curfew? And a lot of people are wondering on social media, did you take too long in issuing that?
Well, let me just say that we did notice that the vast majority of people adhered to the curfew. And at 11 o'clock, even on your air, I was watching your air, people were moving out, which gave the police the opportunity to focus on those people who were intent on breaking the law anyway. So we do think that it was an effective tool for the police, and we made that determination early in the afternoon, I think, or mid-afternoon. And the police throughout the day are gathering intelligence, and their intelligence suggested some organization and tactics that we had noticed from the previous day where they needed additional tools, and that was one. Yes.
Could I follow?
Sure.
By 11 o'clock last night, things had escalated pretty seriously. Why not an earlier time? Could you give us some insight as to why 11 o'clock? Because the hours between 9 and 11 were significantly elevated.
And that's one reason why we're making sometimes, actually, what the chief says is that he saw some escalation starting as early as 7. And so we're going to give them the maximum amount of time and tools that they need, because they started noticing some activity that was non-peaceable as early as 7. Yes, Lou.
You or the chief might comment, if you haven't already, on what appeared from watching the live coverage last night from the local TV stations of the disruptions downtown and elsewhere, that it appeared that the police were nowhere to be seen when windows were being broken and merchandise were being stolen. Is this possibly an overreaction to the inauguration incident when there was complaints that too many people were arrested and ensnared in this?
No, I can assure you that this police chief and force, and certainly me, are very focused on maintaining public order, and that includes people that are vandalizing and looting. And certainly the chief is going to deploy his team and all of the folks that are supporting, protecting the city with doing that and prioritizing and going to where they're needed first and fastest, and doing it as quickly and safely as possible. So that's what I would say. I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of business owners who were the subject of some of that vandalism and looting. And many of them said that they did see the police and saw the police arrive, and there were just quite a number of people that were engaged in that activity. But let me ask the chief to talk specifically about his deployment.
Yeah, Lou, so as you know, there was multiple simultaneous incidents across the city over a pretty expansive region. Whenever we received information, and this is where the community is critical, whenever we received information of looting or destruction of property, we were able to get resources there relatively quick. Quick is in the eyes of the beholder. You know what I mean? So if you want to sit there and take 60 seconds of footage and say there's no police around, there's the potential to do that. I think the narrative to the story is better told by communication with the victims of these crimes, the business owners, whether or not the police were out there. The mayor has her fingers on the pulse of that information. You know, we are, if something happens tonight, in any part of this city, our responsibility, if it's a crime, is to get there as quickly as possible and assure that the offenders are held accountable. That will be our posture throughout the evening. And I want to reiterate this, and I probably will every time I'm asked to come to the microphone. There will be a curfew tonight beginning at 7 p.m. If you are not a member of the media or you do not have an essential function, you can anticipate that local police and federal police will take you into custody. That is a warning, and I am hopeful that that warning will be shared with everybody who is listening.
Yes, sir. Chief, why don't you stay up?
Question about fire department response last night, and
Sure.
maybe Chief Dean can answer this. Was there any time in which there was a fire reported where there was a delay in getting fire equipment in there because they didn't have a police escort, or were they told not to go in to a certain situation because they didn't have a police escort? And then secondly, there was a reported fire at St. John's, and there may have been a delay in getting fire equipment there. Can somebody address that?
Yes, and I will ask the Chief Dean. Our Gregory Dean, who is the Chief of DC Fire and EMS, has joined us, and I want to, before I kick it to him, thank the men and women of our fire department and EMS who responded very bravely, not just last night, but the night before as well. I'll also say that I had the chance to walk through St. John's Episcopal Church, and like so many of you, I was quite angry at the vandalism and arson there. Let me be clear that well, I'll leave it to the fire professional to talk about that. But it was in a part of the church that appears to be not in the main sanctuary, but in a room that you walk down into that was set. And it appeared to me, looking at the furnishings, that it was a nursery or a room set aside for kids that was intentionally set. And that does not advance the cause of the protesters, and it puts our firefighters in harm's way. So that type of destruction is intolerable. I also walked through the AFL building and had a chance to talk to the property managers there and the folks who are doing the cleanup there. and got to see the damage of the lobby of the AFL building and the considerable graffiti on the outside. And I don't have to tell you what the men and women of labor have meant to our country in making our country a more fair place. And now they are too responding to this type of vandalism. But the damage, it did not appear, went beyond the lobby. So let me ask Chief Dean to speak on behalf of Fire and EMS, and he can tell you exactly what his members and he himself, who was responding, encountered.
Paul, I couldn't hear your whole question. Can you ask it again?
Sure, Chief. Did you have at any time last night incidences in which you had reported fires but you couldn't get to them because you needed a police escort? And then secondly, was there a delay in getting to that fire at St. John's for one reason or another because of the protesters or the looters, damagers, arsonists, what have you?
So the way we worked our responses last night is calls went to the Joint Operations Center. And once they identified it, we determined whether the area was safe to enter or not safe to enter. On the one on St. Paul's, we were right there, but you had quite a large crowd there. So it required that we clear the area before we brought in the fire trucks and everything else. So yes, there was a limited delay in being able to make sure we were able to push the protesters back so we could bring in the fire trucks and be able to look at that. At the same time, if you remember, we also had the comfort station that was on fire right there, as well as a dumpster fire in the middle of the street, our trash can fire in the middle of the street. So we had to push everybody back before we could get there. We really, the fire for the church was down in Enclave and back behind. It took a while to get down there and see exactly what was going on and what was happening once we got there.
Just to follow up, were there other places in the city where you felt it was too dangerous to go without a police escort?
Well, there were other responses, and again, working with the Joint Operations Center where we had police and fire embedded, we always asked the question, was the scene secure? And if it was not, then you waited for police before we staged outside that area until it was secure, and then we came in once they secured the scene.
Can I just add something before we move on? I also want to acknowledge DPW, the DC Department of Public Works, and you may not think they're in the firefighting business, but they helped prevent fires. And let me tell you how. So DPW spent the last 24 hours going through the downtown, removing trash cans and dumpsters, which we saw in the previous night had been used to set fires. And we think that in itself made our fire resources available in the event that we had a structure fire. So I want to thank DPW for doing that, and also for going through and removing items that could become projectiles. We know our DC bids were a part of that process as well, and we want them to continue to do that. Now, the public can also help in this regard by moving their vehicles. If you live there or work in the downtown area, we would say generally south of K, you should move your vehicles. And that way we're not going to have sitting targets for people, and we'll keep our fire resources available for the most significant cases. Yes, Martin.
This is for, well, real quick, there was another question just about the timing of the curfew tomorrow. Since the primary is running, polls are supposed to be open until 8, so people are asking if the curfew is going to overlap with polls being open. And then for Chief Newsham, there was images floating around of police officers, MPD police officers, kind of symbolically taking a knee in front of some of the protest groups. Do you have any thoughts on that? You know, kind of some of the feelings that officers might actually be feeling confronting the current situation with policing in America and kind of just the tension that's out there.
What I'll say about that is there is nobody on this police department that I know that isn't personally impacted by what we saw in Minneapolis with the death of George Floyd. And our police officers, like everybody else, are human beings. But also, we have a job to do. We have to ensure that the people that are set on destroying our city are held accountable for that. So we have to have that balance. On the one side of me is very happy that people understand how we feel about this issue and how we are appalled by this issue. On the same token, I think we are very, very disturbed to be here in this city and to see some people tearing up our city. And as the mayor mentioned, that is not advancing the cause. That is not a respectful way to treat the memory of a person who unnecessarily lost their life in this country. I don't know if that helps you with your answer, but that's how I feel.
Hold on 1 second. Did you ask? You haven't had a question. Okay.
Going back to the question of police intervention during looting and property damage, I mean, we're just hearing a lot from residents who are confused. Like, why wouldn't the police do something if they're nearby while it's underway? Can you help explain what the policing reason for why you might not want to intervene during a looting in progress?
I don't know of any instances where our police didn't intervene in a looting in progress. I can tell you one of the tactics that we are seeing is when we do take police action in the large crowds, that it agitates the crowds and it becomes very volatile and very dangerous for our officers. So we have to balance when we're making an arrest or respond to a call for a service, we have to balance the safety of the people that are there with ensuring that we're holding people accountable. At the end of the day, it is my sense that when this is over, that our community is going to be extremely frustrated with the bad actors who are causing this and doing this to our city. And my sense is that those people are going to come forward and we're going to hold a lot of these people accountable for that. So if you don't see an arrest situation on the scene, you can rest assured that we are not going to rest until we hold everybody who's involved in this behavior accountable for what they did. So that's my message to the community. If you don't see an immediate arrest on the scene, the follow-up will be precise and the follow-up will be thorough.
And both you, Chief, and the mayor have raised concerns about the property damage and the violence overshadowing the purpose of these protests, which is to raise issues about racial inequality and police brutality. Is the district government contributing to the purpose of the protests getting lost because all this damage is happening?
I don't know if I understand the logic of your question.
The DC government is the one responsible for preventing this kind of damage and why it's looting. Is the DC government?
No, the people who are looting are responsible for not looting, and we're responsible for finding them. So if your question is the DC government responsible that people, I'm sorry, I just don't understand it. But my untrained view, I'm not a physician, is that we're very concerned, and we're very concerned because this type of activity is happening all across the country and people are traveling all across the country. So my view is that I'm concerned, and I continue to tell people. And one thing I will say is looking at a vast majority of the people down here protesting, they had on masks. They weren't social distancing. I don't know if they had on masks the entire time, but we had a lot of people. So in the Chiefs world, this is a First Amendment demonstration response. In Dr. Nesbitt's world, this is a mass gathering that we don't want for the prevention of COVID. So let me turn to Dr. Nesbitt.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I don't have much more to add substantially to your response because you have articulated our concerns adequately. We have advanced into our phased reopening, but our issues and concerns remain. Mass gatherings are not something we would support at this time, and whether it be a peaceful protest or whether people are conducting activities that would be of concern to our law enforcement, individuals are still coming together in large numbers. While, as the mayor stated, there have been some observations that individuals are wearing masks, but they still are gathering in large numbers. Outdoor mass gatherings present a concern because individuals do not properly social distance. We have shared over and over again that face coverings are not a replacement for individuals' ability to not properly social distance. There are other things that come into concern in terms of the ability to practice good hand hygiene, have other types of sanitation. So the fact that there are large mass gatherings going on in the district and other places across the country are of concern from a public health perspective.
Could I follow on the masks with the chief just for a second? Chief, the fact that everybody seems to be wearing masks is how big of a problem is that going to be to identify some of these bad actors?
It will prevent some problems, but I'm absolutely sure that we have images available. We've already put out some preliminary images where the people that are seen in those images can be identified by our community. One of the things I did not mention is for those of us who don't feel the responsibility to make identifications in those cases, and I think there'll be very few of those, we will also be offering a reward of up to $1,000 for everybody who can identify one of the persons that's seen in these. We'll have videos and we'll have pictures. So my sense is that people will be angry. People will not want to have a reoccurrence of this, not only in our city but anywhere in the country. And I believe people are going to cooperate and come forward and give us the information we need. The last piece I will add to that to inspire people to help us is that this will give us potentially valuable information about your question as to who was involved and whether or not this was an orchestrated event, so we can prevent it from occurring ever again.
They were told by officers that there had been arrests for people with guns, possibly even firing guns into the air in Georgetown. Can you
There was no arrest for gunfire in Georgetown last night. We did have a report of the sounds of gunshots in Georgetown last night, and we did recover shell casings. That matter is currently under investigation. There were no injuries as a result of the sounds of gunshots. Yes?
Yes, sir. One question for the Chief, one for the Mayor, Tom, Channel 7. Is the National Guard helping you at all, and if so, how, and will they continue to be used?
Last night, the National Guard was primarily in support of the Park Police. So the National Guard has reached out to me multiple times this morning to see if we can have them play a bigger role.
Will you take them up on that?
Absolutely.
One question for Mayor Bowser. What do you say to the business owners in the city that were just able to reopen and now have to shut down again because of this curfew, and they're hurting so badly right now economically?
Well, we're saying, and I think the chief said it best, that we know that this is an imposition on people's free movement, and nobody goes into that lightly, but we also think it's necessary for public safety. And I think that the business owners get it. They get it better, actually, than most. Yes.
I wanted to ask about people that may be crossing state lines to come into D.C. to protest. How will you hold those people accountable?
Oh, they're subject to the laws of the District of Columbia when they're in the District of Columbia. So if they violate curfew, they will be arrested.
How does that work with them crossing potentially state lines to commit a potential crime?
I don't know if there's anything if there's any color to that.
I'm going to correct your question. I think you're talking about the bad actors, the instigators, the people who are causing problems. There are federal statutes that address crossing state lines with the intent of committing a crime, and if we need to look into that, we will.
Yes.
Mayor Bowser, you talked on Meet the Press about the president's tweets, some of his comments. Can you revisit that and also say what you'd like to hear from him?
Well, to be honest with you, I think I've said what I have to say about those tweets, and I've been very concerned about those tweets. I think they were very intentional about hearkening to days where African Americans were terrorized in this country, talking about looting and shooting and the release of vicious dogs. And I'll leave it at that. I think that type of language needs to stay in the past.
What would you like to hear from him towards healing?
I think that the president has a special role to make sure that people know that justice will be served, and I think that's his primary role right now. Yes.
Chief, to you, I know that the last time we had something this significant was inauguration. Lots of people were arrested. Lots of people were charged for rioting. That didn't exactly pan out when it came to trials. Are you at all concerned that this could be the same? Are police doing anything different to make sure that if they arrest someone for rioting, there's enough evidence to sustain that in a courtroom? Any concern about the trial element of that?
I think that's a great question, and I've given that a lot of thought. Back in the inauguration in January of 2017, we had the similar behavior of people who came to our city with the intent on destroying property. Business owners that were the victims of those crimes can tell you the impact of that on their lives and their businesses, which was significant. And I think that in some cases our juries forgot. And I'm hopeful when we come around to holding the people responsible for this in Washington, D.C. accountable, that our juries don't forget of the impact of this. We're coming off or trying to come off of this COVID-19 issue. We're trying to save lives. And I know that we had a significant event that occurred in our country that impacts us all, and we all want to do something. But this is not what you do. So I guess my answer to your question is when the wheel comes round and criminal penalties are going to be metered out, I hope our juries don't forget about this.
Okay, we'll take a couple more. Yes, Mark?
Mayor Bowser, could you just comment on what you say to the residents and how everybody is dealing with these dual crises? I mean, how you're dealing with it as a leader and how residents are dealing with the fact that on the one hand, or even more than dual, there's a recession, there's a pandemic, and now there are riots in the streets and there's a curfew. Can you just kind of empathize with the public and kind of speak to that?
I absolutely empathize with the public, and you put it in a nutshell, Mark. There's a lot of heavy things happening at people all at once, and most people can't ever think of an occasion like this in their lives, where they're dealing with anxieties about health, employment, how they're going to pay their bills. Spirit. I think people are also very torn because they feel so sad and angry about the killing of George Floyd. They're very and very empathetic, but also they don't want their city torn up. So I think that is what we are managing. But if you ask me how I'm doing, I'm very proud of our team. Because they're working hard and smart for DC residents.
Can I ask a COVID question?
Yeah.
The community spread trend data once again is paused, according to your website, due to a possible spike that's being investigated. Can you update us on that?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Dr. Nesbitt to speak to that.
Sure. So, you ready, Mark? So a couple of things that I'll give you. So you'll remember that the community spread is based on symptom onset. And there's another factor that I want you to take into consideration as well. After we met 14 days of decline when we were still in phase 0, we continued to count those additional days of decline. When we entered into phase 1, we automatically began a count of day 0 on May 29th, because we want to begin to look for a 14-day decline in phase 1. So day 0 began again on May 29th. Because we calculate the number of individuals who on any given day, their symptom onset comes in because people get tested, we know a certain number of people did not present, or we had low numbers of people presenting for testing over the Memorial Day weekend. So we anticipate that we're going to get more people who were presenting for testing on who have a symptom onset that is linked back to that May 22nd day that aligns with May 29th. Does that make sense? Sort of. If you look at the graph that's on the website, it'll click for you a little bit more. So day 0 starts all over again on May 29th because it's the first day of phase 1. But we also want people to understand that there's going to be a little volatility in those first couple of days to really set what day 0 really is, because of variability around that symptom onset for not a lot of people getting tested around Memorial Day weekend, which will go back to the symptom onset around having symptom onsets around May 22nd, May 23rd, etc. Which impacts the 29th.
So, but you're not publishing the new 14-day count from May 29, day 0 for phase 2. What we get is the 17-day count that goes back.
It's my understanding it's on the coronavirus.dc.gov website. Yeah.
Somebody will send it. So can I just follow up 2 quick questions?
Sure.
So I know you factor out congregate settings for community spread. Will you factor in or out test data that is traced back to these mass gatherings in the protest? If you determine there's a number specifically associated with mass gatherings, will that be factored in or out of your community spread data?
So if the individuals are DC residents, it will be figured in. And as we ramp up our contact tracing, we'll try as best as we can to link their exposure to having participated in one of these events, but it could be tricky to do so, right? So if people are going to work, if they're going to dine in at the outdoor restaurants, and we do a complete interview of all of the activities that they participated in, we may be able to link their activity or participation to one of these protests, but it will depend on the proportion, as Chief Newsham mentioned, of the protest participants who are in fact DC residents, because the cases that we interview are DC residents. Now, we may be able to work with some of our colleagues from other jurisdictions who are identifying cases where people participated in some of these protests in other states and other jurisdictions. But that inherently is one of the challenges of people participating in what we call tourism, going to participate in other activities across state lines, which is not recommended at this point by the CDC.
My last question, I appreciate it. Can you give us your metrics yet for phase 2?
We will be getting into that discussion later this week. As you know, we have planned to talk more about those things in the first couple of days of this week, but other activities have prevailed.
Yes.
Mayor Bowser, overnight there was a lot of social media activity about a supposed DC communications shutdown. Can you confirm that this is false? And then more broadly, what's your strategy in responding to online disinformation that can inflame conditions on the ground?
I'm going to have the chief start, and then Chris Rodriguez.
There was no communications loss that I saw in any way, shape, or form. I'm in close contact with Karima Holmes, the director of our Office of Unified Communication. If we had an issue with communications, we would have been communicating. So I don't know where that information came from. And that's why I rarely take a lot of the information that I get from social media on its face.
Thank you. Chris Rodriguez.
Hi, I'm Chris Rodriguez, Director of DC Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency. HCEMA has been supporting MPD throughout this event and looking at specifically disinformation campaigns and social media. We have identified some and have passed that information to federal authorities, to the FBI, and to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and we are also passing that information to MPD so that officers, not only right down here down the road, but also in the field, have that information. So we are monitoring those social media avenues.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
We now return to our previously